reception for one of my doctoral students, so that was very nice some years back. What I've been asked to do is talk a little bit about the whole notion of writing books and what one does as an academic and what one does as sort of a freelancer in retirement and trying to get books produced, and share in the process of that a whole series of books that I've been able to write during my career. I came down here right following my doctorate at Cornell and worked at Georgia Tech from 1973, which seems like the Middle Ages, but way back in 1973 up until 2011, which is about 38 years of teaching with students that have really gone out and done superb things. The doctoral student that I mentioned is now the executive director of the Lutyens Trust, which does wonderful webinars on the English architect Edwin Lutyens, and those are free and wonderful to watch every month. This notion of describing scholarly publications and different writing activities takes two parts in a way, because there's a series of activities that one gets involved with when you're teaching. There's this huge publisher perish kind of syndrome, and you're always pushing to get things out. And then after you're retired, you continue to write if you're interested in doing that, and your wife says, I thought you were retired, and you're sitting there in the office still doing what you've been doing all along. But it's been able to kind of manipulate these things back and forth and get work produced, which is what I'm interested in doing. You do a lot of research and you want to get it out, and you want people to see what you've been able to find out about, in my case, the history of architecture. I came to all this with sort of a strange background, certainly in the fact that I've spent all these years at an Institute of Technology. I am not technologically savvy, but I have been surrounded by engineers my whole teaching career. My undergraduate degree is in history and also in education, because I thought at that point that I was going to teach French in high school. Silly thing to think about, but I thought I was going to do that, and I took some French in college, anticipating that. But then I ran into a supremely fine teacher at Principia College, who some of you may know if you're interested in historic preservation. His name was Charles B. Hosmer Jr., and he is the author of the histories, I say plural, of the American preservation movement. The first was a study called Presence of the Past, which discussed the beginnings of historic preservation in the United States, the ladies of the Mount Vernon Association and the people that were saving Monticello and a number of them. And then he undertook, in fact, while I was at school with him, he undertook a huge project, a 2-volume study on the history of historic preservation in the United States from Williamsburg to the founding of the National Trust in the 60s. So he is really responsible for the definitive histories of the profession, if you're interested in historic preservation. He was so interesting as a historian that he would bring buildings in when he was just teaching an American history course. There was no architecture program at that college. It was a very small college. But he interested me in looking at buildings. And in fact, it was interesting that I took a course called the Western Movement from him at one point. And when a friend of mine who was from Alabama was going to marry a young lady from Los Angeles and asked me, who at the time was in Maryland, to become his best man, and a guy from Connecticut and another one from Chicago to become the ushers in Los Angeles, it gave this opportunity that we could in fact follow the Oregon Trail to California, which is exactly what we did. We all had studied this course with Charles Hosmer on the Western Movement, and the guy from Connecticut came down to Maryland, got in my car, we drove to Chicago, then we drove to Independence, Missouri, and off we went. And we started looking at geological landmarks, Chimney Rock and Independence Rock and all those kinds of things that the wagons followed to get to Oregon Trail, simply because of this course and this wonderful teacher. So the book that I wrote on the building of Principia College, because I also got interested in Bernard Maybeck, is a book that won a couple of book awards and is dedicated to Charles Hosmer. That's back there as well. It weighs 7.5 pounds, so if you have a coffee table that you need holding up, it's a great book for that kind of purpose. one of the things that relates to describing the writing activity in different publications is this idea of, do you plan your career, or is it a matter, in part at least, of serendipity? And there's some really interesting things that have occurred in amongst all these various books that really have resulted from unplanned serendipitous opportunities that you take advantage of if you can. Academic papers and class lectures and scholarly organizations can ultimately shape books, and if the idea fundamentally is to try to get much out into the field, you use one against the other to really make it come out in a good way. Let me go back to this one. Where is it? They went in a different order than I thought it did. I'll just make a mention of a couple of these scholarly organizations. Get this on the right line. There we go. That have participated in this kind of thing. A number of them are interesting that they've been, even though they're regional societies, they've been founded here in Atlanta. And they've had a long history in Atlanta. One of them has that sort of unfortunate acronym called CSEX, which is the Southeast American Association of 18th Century Studies. And that was founded with some people at Emory and Georgia Tech, and one of the women in the English department was very active, and we've just in fact published a festschrift that'll be out in about a month or two, I think, in honor of Annabelle Jenkins, who's one of the founders of those organizations. The 19th Century Studies Association was also founded with people at Morehouse and Emory and ultimately Georgia Tech early on in its long career. And one that I'm particularly proud of, because we founded it about almost 40 years ago in room 258 in the West Architecture Building at Georgia Tech, was the Southeast chapter of the Society of Architectural Historians. This is an organization that started with the invitation for 6 states to send academics to Georgia Tech just for a conference. We just had a couple of paper sessions, maybe 8 papers altogether, with the idea we would see as to whether or not we would have this effectively local chapter of the Society of Architectural Historians that would bring together historians of architecture on an annual basis for an annual meeting, or maybe have a journal, which they ultimately decided to have, and the like. And it all worked out extremely well. The 6 states were Georgia and those states that touched Georgia, so Alabama, North and South Carolina, Tennessee, and Florida. And we then, within a few years, had grown to 12 states. So we are a huge regional organization now, with conferences every year and academic papers with well over 100, 150 people coming every year to share their ideas about the history of architecture. And papers are on all kinds of things, including Atlanta topics and Georgia topics and various other things, depending on what people are involved in. What often happened in my case was that if a paper was suggested for one of these academic societies, then it might end up making a major role as a chapter in one of the books that I might be planning. So you kind of work these things together, that if you get involved in some research, it ends up becoming a chapter in a book, then you may pull something like that out and share it with your academics. Then they give you feedback back and forth. And so those kinds of planned activities become extremely helpful. And as a result, people started inviting you to do all kinds of things. And so I got involved, not because I was an architectural historian, because most of the people in one of these other groups called CCAC, which is the Southeast College Art Conference, and the latest book that just literally came out October 25th on Atlanta public art is more aligned with the kind of thing that artists, practicing artists and art historians rather than architectural historians would find interesting about the city's work of late in outdoor sculpture, public art, and murals, which are all over the Atlanta area, including some that are in Decatur that are also in the book. The CCAC group gave me an opportunity to edit their scholarly art review for a number of years in the 1980s, and as a result of that and several other editorial opportunities, most recently, just before I retired, I was asked to become the architecture editor for the Grove Dictionary of American Art, which is a 5-volume massive study published by Oxford University Press and covering all disciplines, all media, all countries, and all times. So it took 5 volumes to really address this, and it was painting, architecture, sculpture, and a whole range of them, but I was interested and was able to take a major role in the activity of that. Well, that kept me awfully busy, and so I was, things were on the shelf, and I wanted to get books out. I wanted to get the, well, you know about this, Richard. You get these certain things that you want to get engaged in, and just everything gets put slightly in the way. What became even more involved, and here are a few of the activities that may not be able to read that, but I came to Georgia Tech in the 1970s. In the middle of the 1970s, they sent me to Paris, which was great. I mean, I was able to spend 7 months in Paris administering a broad program for Georgia Tech architects, and they ran this for 30 or 35 years. We were doing this in the second year, which was great because they had a huge number the first year. And when Carol and I were able to go over there and administer the program and give a history lecture and art history lectures in Paris, there were about 15 students, which is a great number to kind of work with. And one of them we see still today, he's a vice president at Stevens & Wilkinson. I mean, these people have come and done major work with architecture as they started their career. But their projects, their whole senior year would be spent in Paris. And we had an opportunity to go literally as a honeymoon, because we had just been married in 1975, and we spent 1976 in Paris involved with this wonderful program that Georgia Tech ran. I also had an opportunity to go to Australia because I was very interested in Art Deco, and one of the books in the back is about the Art Deco period in Atlanta. It covers Art Deco and Modern Classic. There are some wonderful Art Deco buildings right here in Decatur, which are in the book. The Sherian Rug Building, the Rutland Building just down the way, and others all through Atlanta, including skyscrapers by Pringland Smith and others that are very well known. But that was an opportunity to share some Atlanta streamlined, modern, and Art Deco buildings in Western Australia, invited there by the president of the Western Australia Art Deco Society. There was a program called the World Congress on Art Deco, and this was the second World Congress, the one I went to in the 80s. And they've been doing these every couple of years ever since, somewhere in the world where there's a lot of Art Deco architecture. So they've been all over the place, but that one in Perth was very enjoyable for me to get involved in. Well, over the years, as a result of these kinds of things, I've been able to get some 36 essays in different dictionaries of art and architecture and garden design. One of the really better ones is local here, the University of Georgia Press publishes, which you should know about, I'm sure most of you do, the New Georgia Encyclopedia. There are a number of essays all through that, some on architecture, some on art, a lot on history, and I was early on involved in that with some 27 essays on architecture, a lot of them in the Atlanta area and the like. So all of that kept me fairly busy, but not busy enough. I was still distracted by things such as this, the restoration of the Smith-Benning House. Carol and I bought this house when it was 100 years old, in about 1982 or 3. And we spent 30 years restoring it. It just was one of these things that we didn't have enough money to do it right early on, so we put the money somewhere else, and then we put that money somewhere else, and it would grow in little pots, and by the time we got to the early 2000s, it still was only half restored, and we still wanted to do it right, so we said, well, that's where all the pot of money is now going to go, and try to get this finished off. So it's pretty well restored. We still have to do a lot on the landscape and the grounds, but this is a house that was built by Charles Whiteford Smith, used by the Smiths for 5 or 6 years, and then he sold it to a sea captain, Captain Augustus Benning, who was from Savannah but engaged in the China trade. Supposed to have had a wife and family in China and another wife and family here, but presumably not at the same time, but at the same notion. He was very active and was part of the consortium ultimately once he moved to Atlanta and bought this house from the Smiths in the building of the Flatiron Building. There were several businessmen who got together to build what is Atlanta's earliest still standing skyscraper, the Flatiron Building downtown. One of the things that helped us maneuver and sort of leverage the money to do that is, again, part of the historic preservation side of what we did, and that is that we purchased and then restored and ultimately sold, again, 8 different rental houses in the area near Georgia Tech, and probably provided housing for some 400 over the years, Georgia Tech students in those residence halls. The point that we were trying to do is, as those became a bit more valuable, then we would sell them and put the money in the Smith Benning house. So it's all poured into that restoration, but it allowed us to hopefully do it properly. And in addition to that, we did the same thing in a commercial building, which was a bigger task even still. This is on North Highland, just behind Plaza Drugs. It's halfway between Manuel's Tavern and Plaza, Briarcliff Plaza. It's called the Chelsea Building now, but that's the name we gave it. It was built in 1921. The little tile work we did on the entryway in the middle unit, which is 654 North Highland, has the date that the building was built and the date that it was restored, and this name we gave to it, the Chelsea Building. But it is now, if you know that area, it is now the Sweet Auburn Barbecue, and we were able to put some major effort in restoring that, primarily because the only thing we could afford when we ever started these things was to get absolute wrecks. Things were falling down. In the case of the Smith Benning house, we hadn't owned it very long before the fire company came with several fire engines, came into the park, parked in our front yard, and said, we'd like to use this as a test burn to train our firefighters. And we thought, no, we're living here, and no thanks. I don't know if they were joking, but I certainly wasn't joking. I didn't want them to use it as a test burn, thank you very much. But it was in that terrible condition. And in the case of the Sweet Auburn Barbecue, which we restored in the 80s and 90s and up to about, I forgot when we sold it, 10 years ago maybe, we started, it had 3.5 brick walls of dirt and sky. And so we literally had to put it all back and try to make it look on the outside the way it always has looked since the 1920s to keep its integrity. Various people have painted it different colors at different times in its career and put awnings and various other things, but it's essentially the building that was built in 1921 and has kept us active in that. Well, I mention all that because when you deal with these last 2 buildings, which tonight's something of a celebration of 2 latest buildings, books, having been published, they are my 12th and 13th book over the career. The point being that in the 38 years I was at Georgia Tech, I was able to publish 5 books. In the 11 years that I've been retired, I've been able to put out 9 books. That tells you how demanding it is to teach at Georgia Tech and how much you're engaged with students and how you have so many other activities that keep those from coming out as you would hope they might. And that is something of the scorecard you can see at the bottom of that. But what was interesting in terms of Georgia Tech, and some of you may have had these kinds of experiences, and that is that because I was a historian and I was interested in art and I was interested in architectural history, not so much the technical and engineering side, but I was surrounded by engineers. I mean, I was at an Institute of Technology. And I remember a significant occurrence in the early 1950s when the Reed Lecture at Cambridge University in England was delivered by C.P. Snow, and it was published later by Cambridge University Press, and that lecture was called The Two Cultures. And what C.P. Snow was describing in that era, post-World War II era, was that, as he put it, the world has divided itself into 2 opposing camps. One he described as the engineers and the scientists, the other as the literati, those who are interested in arts and humanities, liberal arts, etc. And as you know, colleges are often one or the other, or certainly are substantially one or the other. And Georgia Tech would not be described necessarily as a liberal arts college, but would be described as an engineering school, a research institution. The College of Architecture was originally part of the College of Engineering. It became its own college later on, but it was very much a black sheep in a white fold, or a white sheep in a black fold when I arrived at Georgia Tech. Here's somebody that was interested in art and architecture. I think might have been the only PhD in the architecture college. I was interested in developing courses on the history of architecture. Most of the other people were teaching design as practical studio work and engineering and structures and these kinds of things. But that notion of trying to work your way through the publisher parish side of teaching at an institute of technology created this circumstance. As a research institution, Georgia Tech's definition of research was more funded research. They were interested in going outside the institute, bringing in money to the school that would fund research that might be subsidized by the Department of Defense or the Department of Health or Department of Energy or whoever it might be. And there just weren't the opportunities in art and architecture for getting that kind of funding. My definition of research was scholarship. It had to do with writing books, and so the idea of doing that worked its way through a number of sometimes serendipitous and sometimes really good opportunities that I was able to take advantage of. And so the books, many of which are back there, are part of that journey. So to some degree, that's what I've been asked to talk a little bit about, is that journey through the various activities. And so early on, it started with just writing a few articles for architecture magazines, even popular architectural magazines. I was asked to do some monographic articles of individual houses in Atlanta for a publication called Southern Homes. I don't know if you remember that. It's not published anymore. It's called Atlanta Lifestyles, I think now. But it was modeled on Architectural Digest, and they would have individual very beautifully photographed, illustrated articles on individual houses around the region. Its sort of sister publication was called Southern Accents. They both were really modeled on Architectural Digest, and Southern Homes asked me to write a number of these, and it included, as it turned happenstantially, that one of the ones they wanted me to write on was John Portman's house in Atlanta, which Portman called Entelechy 1, and is located on Northside Drive. I said that I would do that, and even though I had not really seen the house, but I was able to go there, and I was given sort of free rein. One of Portman's sons took me through the house. I went there with my camera so I could take visual notes, and then I went home and wrote the article. But before I left, I thought it was very amusing. When I told him I was finished and it was time to leave, I found him way in the depths of the house, way back in the most private part of the residence, and he was sitting back on the sofa, watching on this big screen television, Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. I said, well, this is a great moment to kind of capture that. But Southern Homes realized that in 1987, Atlanta was going to celebrate its sesquicentennial. The city was founded in 1837, so 1987 was its 150th birthday. And so the magazine decided to sponsor a book publication on homes in Atlanta during that 150 years. And so they had a few people that had been involved in writing these shorter essays, so the magazine led to the first book. And so my first activity was a co-authored book with several colleagues, Elizabeth Dowling, who writes on Philip Schutze, and she was interested. We were going to deal with the 20th century houses, which is a good chunk of what Atlanta had been producing. And Betty said to me, I'll write on Schutze, you write on everybody else. And so it gave me sort of free rein to pick some interesting houses, including Portman's house. And then William Mitchell, a freelance historian, and Elizabeth Stanfield dealt with a lot of the 19th century and earlier 20th century. Portman apparently liked what I wrote, and so some years later, he was asked by a publisher in Milan, Italy, to put together a monograph on his work up to that time. This was in 1990. Portman was active since the mid-50s, so he had a substantial amount of work to that he had accomplished, but 1990 seems a long time ago. He only passed away a couple of years ago, and his work has been extensively developed even since then. But L'Archidizione was interested in a monograph on contemporary architects, and they'd selected Portman as one of the architects they were going to write a monograph on. It was going to be written in English and Italian, and the idea that Portman had was that his two houses, the house in Atlanta, and he had just finished his what became sort of a notorious beach house on Sea Island, which was a big 22,000 square feet of living space in a concrete house on Sea Island in Georgia. And that house had been written up in Architectural Digest by Paul Goldberger, who is the architectural critic of the New York Times. So when this new monograph came along, they decided that they were going to reprint Goldberger's essay on the Sea Island house, and they were going to take my essay, and he didn't want to reprint both of them. He said, why don't we develop the idea there and do a slight rewrite on mine? And they would be the bookends, and all of his work in between would be dealt with these splendid photographs and captions and small bits that Mr. Portman would oversee, but that he would kind of leave these two essays as the narrative part of the book. So the book John Portman, with this tall version of the #1 Peachtree Center, which is now the SunTrust Bank building on the cover, but it wasn't even built at the time this was projected. It was just a project at that point. And the book came out in 1990. Several years later, the same editor came back to Mr. Portman and said, now we are doing another series of books on landmarks of the contemporary architectural scene, individual buildings that we want to do a whole book on. And we would like to do a book on the Sea Island beach house. And to my shock and amazement, Mr. Portman called me up again and said, we want you to write the critical essay for the monograph on the Sea Island beach house. And I thought, well, that's odd. Why would he? I mean, Paul Goldberger of the New York Times architectural critic wrote the piece in Architectural Digest. Now, I don't know if he didn't like that piece or what the theory was, but it was a great opportunity for me, because here it is. I'd already had a good combination of the first book with Paul Goldberger, and then I have this second opportunity with Mr. Portman, who's internationally renowned. The public or perish was working out. I mean, I needed to get this stuff done. I certainly was not going to say no to Mr. Portman. So yes, we went forward, and I was able to spend the weekend at the beach house, see it when the sun comes up in the morning over the ocean, see it at high noon as the shadows change all through the day, see it when the sun sets at the afternoon, look through. It is full of Mr. Portman's paintings. It is full of Mr. Portman's sculpture. It was a retreat that he used every weekend when he would leave his office, have a driver driving down to Sea Island, and when he came back to the office on Monday, people would ask him, was this a 2-painting weekend, or was it a 1-sculpture weekend, or what did you create this weekend? And Portman used this house because he knew that it took longer to get the ideas that would be embedded in a building out, but he could get an idea that would be embedded in a painting out more quickly. And so those media he began to develop in the mid-'80s and do all kinds of extraordinary work, not as an architect, but as a painter and as a sculptor and as a furniture maker. And it was, the house is a museum house, it's a retreat, it's an art museum, it's a private home, it just has all this stuff going for it. So I was able to write this essay, sent it off. In fact, I went up to Maryland, where I have a little beach cottage, and I sat on my beach and I wrote about his beach, his beach house, and sent it back to the office that would go off to Italy. What was interesting as well, I thought, was that I initially thought, you know, I've never even seen this house when I was first asked to do this. I'd never been down there. I knew something about it, but it was brand new in any case. So I said, I really need to talk to Mr. Portman and see, you know, get some ideas about what this article ought to include. He said, no, I'm not going to say anything to you. He said, I want you to go down there and analyze it. I want you to go down there and just write what you see and write what you think needs writing. And I thought, what a confident fellow this is, that he would not be telling me what to say in this and doing any kind of censorship. So I was very grateful for that opportunity because this was mid-career for me. I was getting another publication out. It was actually an international publication, which made it even nicer. And Mr. Portman was certainly a good bedfellow to be sharing such activities with. And so before I finished everything up, I was sitting on the beach, and in the 90s, when this was being done, I'd started writing a little poetry as well. So I decided to write a poem about the beach house, and I enclosed it in a letter that was basically a thank you letter to Mr. Portman, saying, I'm really grateful for this opportunity. This is important to me in my career, and I thank you for the confidence, et cetera, and I enclosed this poem. He published the poem in the book. I didn't have any idea it was even going to appear. I get the copy of the book, and there's the poem there called Temple of Renewal. So now I'm an international poet. You know, all this stuff is going on that you never would have anticipated. Serendipity, unplanned activities. Well, some years after that, the High Museum of Art decided that they were going to hold a retrospective on Mr. Portman's work. He was getting close to being in his 90s, I guess, at that point. This was going to be involved in looking at his full career as a sort of native son in Atlanta by Atlanta's major art museum. And this was a wonderful thing. So I went to the High Museum and I said, you know, you really ought to publish a catalog with this exhibition that they're planning. And of course they looked at me like, are we stupid? Of course we're going to publish a catalog. It's all already underway. And I said, oh, well, that's good. I just want to make sure, because a lot of times they'll have a show and they won't have a catalog. And this is clearly something that they ought to be coupling with a catalog. So I inquired about it, and they said, yes, Paul Goldberger is going to write an essay on Mr. Portman's architecture for the catalog, which will be called The Art and Architecture of John Portman. And I said, well, what about the art? Well, nobody's doing that. We're not doing that. It's just going to have the essay on the architecture. He's really known as an architect. I said, you're an art museum. He's done half this exhibit, more than half of it is about his paintings, his sculpture. I mean, you're going to have all this stuff on exhibit. He says, well, we would, but we really don't have time to produce this. It just takes a while to have somebody be assigned the essay and to write it. And I said, I'll give it to you tomorrow. I basically had said, literally a year or two before that, I had given a paper at the Southeast College Art Conference entitled The Painting, Sculpture, and Furniture of John Portman. It was all about that non-architectural side of Portman, because the conference was full of artists. It wasn't full of architects. And so I looked at the other side of Portman. And they then saw the essay, decided that it could be done within the time. Then I was then sent all the material that was going to go on the exhibit so I could color the essay around what the exhibits were going to be. And so the High Museum and the University of Georgia Press put out this really nice catalog called The Art and Architecture of John Portman, which was part of the exhibit that some of you may have gone to. I don't know if any of you went to it. It was a wonderful exhibit on his work some years ago. And they then invited me to give the kickoff lecture for the exhibit, which was very nice to do as well. And some of you may know the book by Rasmussen called Experiencing Architecture. It's sort of a primer on teaching the do's and don'ts of design to architects. And so my lecture was called Experiencing Portman, which was trying to analyze all the, be a primer for Portman's architecture. It was given at the High Museum. Well, the other early in this first period, while I was still at Georgia Tech, is this Atlanta architecture, Art Deco, and modern classic. And this has had an odd history as well. It really is the first solo book that I published just on my own. I was interested in this period from 1929, about the time the Fox Theater was built, up through the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And it was a period when Deco and streamlined modern like the Varsity, and modern classic like some of the government buildings around the Capitol, and just plain modern was emerging right after World War II. So I wrote an essay that defined these four styles of modern architecture. It was trying to help students understand and distinguish among these different aesthetics that we all could call modern with a lowercase m because they're contemporary and they're modern, but there is a difference between Art Deco And I was arguing there's a difference between that and streamlined modern, and there's a difference between both of those and modern classic and the Depression, and there's certainly a difference between that and what they call the international style and the Bauhaus style of modern with a capital M. So I proposed this book to Pelican. It was to be a series of books based on a series they had just been publishing over the last 10 years on New Orleans architecture. They were headquartered in New Orleans and did regional architecture books occasionally. And so I said, I'd like to do a similar thing to Atlanta. I sent them this whole manuscript that had the defining essay and all the chapters about these 4 different styles. And I inserted, because it was such a landmark in Atlanta in that period, a whole chapter on the Fox Theater. And that went to the press, and the publisher had this somewhat limited notion that he wanted the book to just not be any longer than so many pages, and so he sliced the whole thing in half, and he said, we'll publish the first half, which is just on Art Deco and modern classic, and then we'll publish the second half later. And then they had a fire at the press, and the second half burned up with all kinds of other stuff, other, inventory of books, different stuff. Now I had notes and I had the copies of what I'd sent them, but a lot of the material those days were not sent digitally. They were sent by 8.5 glossy black and white photographs that you actually sent. Every bit of that went up in flames. So that second book kind of got delayed, and it's been delayed for 20 or 30 years. Pelican's now been bought by another press. The man who was in charge wanted me to do another book that was not proper for me to do yet. I was trying to do this in a proper order, and so the second book sort of languished. But it's been out, and I've got some notion that I may pick up on that series and carry on with that in the near future. One of the other things I tell students is do as I say, don't do as I do, because if you talk about your dissertation and writing a major study like a master's thesis, and then you say, I'd like to get this published, then you want to do it sooner than I did. My dissertation was in 1973. It became the book that didn't come out until 2005. That was a long time, almost 30 years before the book came out. The irony is, again, is this serendipity or quite what? When I first finished the work on Bernard Maybeck and Principia College, I knew this was a really important topic and very interesting. I'll tell you why in a minute. But I sent it to Peregrine Smith, a publisher who did a lot of arts and crafts publications, and I said, they're absolutely the ones that'll eat this up. They'll pick this up in a minute. The problem was they had another author doing an entire monograph on all of Maybeck's career. This was only a piece of his career, dealing with the last 15 years and the largest commission and the longest commission, et cetera, but it still was mainly the building of a single college campus. And so they wouldn't do it because of the other book. I was really disappointed. However, had it been published then, all the photographs would have been black and white. And it was 30 years later that I sent it back to the same publisher, who is now Gibbs Smith Publishing, does absolutely gorgeous color books, art books, and has in their mission statement that their mission is to create beautiful books for the betterment of mankind. That is their mission statement. And so they literally spoiled me rotten in publishing the book on Maybeck. Now, what was interesting from a scholarly standpoint was that Maybeck was a California architect. The project was in the St. Louis area in the Midwest. The college was intended to be built right outside of St. Louis, west of the city. It turned out that it was built across the river in Illinois, but because the client was in the Midwest and the architect was in California, they had to write letters back and forth to each other. And they did so for 15 years. And they sent drawings back and forth. And they sent samples of stone back and forth. And the architect would show up on the building site and spend 3 weeks, and they'd do sketches and do those, and then he'd go back to California. And I would be, thinking that, because these letters existed, here was a treasure trove for a historian, because literally any question you might have about intention, about whether the client was pleased with some aspect of the design, whether the client actually participated in any of the design part, anything to do with the design commission was in those letters, and the school kept everything. whether it went to Maybach or whether it came from Maybach. They had made copies and they kept every bit of it in their archives. So when I left my third year at Cornell, I never was on campus at Cornell. I moved to the campus at Principia and I lived in the archives. I taught a couple of courses at the school, kind of pay my way for being there, and I was able to spend all this time dealing with the commission. With respect to writing about college campus architecture, which this newest book on Georgia Tech is a smaller example of the same sort of thing, this kind of established a little bit of a niche that I was filling about architecture on college campuses. And the hope is that that kind of subject will continue. It was very well received. It won a couple of book awards, and in fact, a major bookseller in Chicago said that this was the most thorough and exhaustive study of an architectural commission anytime by anybody ever written, this sort of thing. So it was really got a lot of high praise. And I said that's totally because of that series of materials that were in the archives and being able to work with the archives. So I'm very much a supporter of archival activity, first run work. So the period of Georgia Tech, to recap, has Plantation of Peachtree, the Atlanta Architecture Art Deco book, the John Portman book, the Bernard Maybach book at Principia, and then the art catalog for the High Museum as the five while I was teaching. In the middle of all that, an architect in town named Henry Howard Smith, whose work is not as well known as his father's work, Francis Palmer Smith, but Henry asked if I would write a book on his father. And I knew of Francis Palmer Smith, but I didn't know everything about him. I mean, it turned out that what I did know about him was he was one of the founders of the architecture program at Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech had 2 or 3 students in the early part of the 20th century who recognized that when Georgia Tech was founded in the 1880s, the charter from the state allowed them to pursue certain curriculum. They were allowed to teach mechanical engineering. That's all anybody got for the first few years. That was their degree. Everybody that graduated from Tech in the opening years got a mechanical engineering degree. Then they introduced chemical engineering, they introduced electrical engineering, but they never had architecture. And architecture was approved as one of the disciplines that they were allowed to teach, but nobody had started it. So these students got together and said, we'd like to study architecture. The school said if you can get a handful of people, I forget, it depends on who you ask as to whether it's 9 or 15 or whatever it is, but if you can get enough students to found a program, we'll start it. So they did in 1908. It was one of the earliest architecture programs in the South, and it is really one of the earliest ones in the U.S. I mean, MIT had been doing it for some time, but that's still very early among architecture schools. And it was founded on principles of the Beaux-Arts, that architecture was an art, and it was headed by a man named Hopkins, who decided after a year, even though he was the full professor and he was head of architecture, in fact, he was the entire architecture faculty. There was just one man who was teaching these 10 or 11 students. But among those students was Philip Schutze and Eyvind Crook and ultimately Burgeon Stevens, and the people who literally built Atlanta in the 1920s. But 1 year after they started the program, they suddenly had no professor, and they had these students with nobody to teach them. So Tech sent a message up to the University of Pennsylvania, which had one of the best architecture schools in this country, said, do you have a graduate that we can hire to come down and take over the architecture program? And they said immediately Francis Palmer Smith. He is a man that we just graduated last year. He's actually on a grand tour in Europe right now, looking at medieval architecture, but we wanted him to stay here and teach at Penn, but he wouldn't do it because our program was what he would be teaching was too much architectural engineering oriented. Well, that sounds like just what he'd be stuck with doing at Georgia Tech. But somehow they persuaded him that they would be creating a design school, and that the focus would be on the art of architecture and design. So he accepted the role. He came down, and I think he was, what would he have been, 25, 26? He wasn't only a couple of years older than the students he had. And he stayed for he stayed until 1922, from 1909 to 1922, built several early buildings at Georgia Tech, and then started his own practice with Robert Pringle. And by that time, his graduates had included Philip Schutze, who won the Prix de Rome and built Swan House and all kinds of things around Atlanta, and Bertrand Stevens, who became Stevens and Wilkinson, which is the largest, longest architectural firm in existence today, still active, and Ivy and Crook. Ed Ivy's the one who started the whole program, and several others of really noted figures who were very active once they graduated in building houses and office buildings and churches all over. And among the whole group and on top of the list was Francis Palmer Smith. You know his buildings. You may not know him, you may not know that they are his buildings, but you know his buildings. His last major work was the Cathedral of St. Philip in Buckhead, that yellow stone building that you see going north on Peachtree that looks like you're going to dead end. That was his masterpiece. He started working on that in the 30s, and it wasn't built until 1960 or 62. He also built, he was a church specialist ultimately. He built several churches, First Presbyterian on Ponce de Leon, Grace Methodist on Ponce de Leon, a range of churches in Savannah and various places in North Carolina. Art Deco skyscrapers. In fact, that's how I met Henry. I needed to borrow a drawing of an Art Deco skyscraper that Francis Smith, his father, had designed that I wanted in the Art Deco book. So that's how I was introduced to Henry, and he came back later and asked if I would write this monograph on his father. So that book is over there as well. The architecture of Francis Palmer Smith, Atlanta's scholar architect is what I called him, because he was so active in teaching at Georgia Tech in those early years. Henry had to wait 17 years for that book. I was in the middle of finishing up the Mabeck book. I was in the middle of doing this work with Portman. I didn't tell him about the Portman stuff, but I did tell him about the Mabeck book. I said, you've got to let me finish the Mabeck book and get it out. When we finally got the Francis Smith book out, which came out the year after I retired, the Georgia Archives recognized the book, but they also gave Henry Howard Smith a recognition, an award for stewardship. And why? Because he had kept his father's drawings, he kept his father's records, he kept his father's library. We knew everything in his professional library, we knew all the buildings, he had microfiches of floor plans, just anything you want to know. Again, it was an ideal project, so I took it on and said, yes, absolutely, I'll do this. And University of Georgia Press did a really terrific job. I have to tell you, I went to the University of Press with my Mabeck book, and I put it up about this high, and I let it slam down on the table. I said, that's the standard. Because I said, I've been spoiled by Gibbs Smith, let's do the best we can on the other book. Well, the other things that are very different, and you may all have different interests, and whether any of these provide interest for other reasons, it's another side that one wouldn't have expected, and then of course it's happened since I retired at Georgia Tech. It had nothing to do with any kind of publishing at Tech. But, excuse me, let's see if I can, what's it doing? It's going the wrong way. Why is this going? Oh, there, I'm sorry. I'm pushing the wrong button, sorry. Is it frozen? There we go. This came as a surprise to me as much as it did anybody that knows my work in architectural history, and that is, it is a book of memoirs of Vietnam vets. We just passed a few days ago Veterans Day, and this notion of remembering. The year I retired, I went back to St. Louis to my high school reunion, my 50th high school reunion in 2011. And one of my friends there who lived in Oregon, in fact, Principia was the high school my dad taught at the high school. I went to the college, so the Principia book is about things I knew very, very well. But for this reunion, for this high school reunion, my friend who was from Oregon said, you know, you were in the Navy and I was in the Navy at some point in our lives, right in the middle of the Vietnam War. Everybody was the wrong age at the wrong time is effectively what it was. So almost everybody in our classes joined up in some fashion. And it would be interesting to get people together at the reunion and share sea stories, is the way he put it. And I said, well, that's fine, let's do that. And so before we got finished with that little coterie of small group of people at that high school reunion in 2011, the idea came, well, maybe we'll put a book together about the memoirs of Vietnam vets, because everybody was involved in that era. That's the era we're talking about. We modeled it on a book that you may know, Tom Brokaw's book called The Greatest Generation. The difference is that Brokaw interviewed his World War II vets, some famous, some not so famous people, and then he wrote all their stories. All the writing in The Greatest Generation is Brokaw, recounting what he learned from the interviews. I wanted my people to write their own stories in their own words, tell about their firsthand activities, not heroic things necessarily. Some of them are downright funny. I mean, they're just involved in what they happened to do during that period of time. And just to give you some idea of how this worked, we said, we don't know if we'll get a book or not. It turned out we had 34 vets sending in 50 different stories of their firsthand accounts in the Vietnam era. We projected initially that if they had been in school maybe between 1960 and 1975, 1975 was the year of the fall of Saigon, then that would be the sort of period that we would talk about. Most of them had been in-country Vietnam or flying off of aircraft carriers or whatever it might have been. Some were not involved in Vietnam, but were active in the military during that period. One of them was the closest Navy ship when the Pueblo spy boat got captured by the North Koreans, and it's still in North Korea, by the way, but that was an extraordinary event right in the middle of the Vietnam era. So we put this call out thinking, well, if we get response, we'll have a book. If we don't get response, we won't have a book. But I was sort of pegged to do the editing and to write up the bios of anybody who we decided to use, and to accept and kind of filter through the submissions. The first email I got was from Berlin, Germany. The email said, I was at the college and I heard about this project, but I wasn't in the military, and I'm a woman. And I'm not from the period you're talking about. I graduated in 58 or 57 or something. So everything was not at all what I described and what this call was. And I thought, well, why is she writing me? This seemed very strange. And she said, well, I was an international journalist and I was stationed in Saigon and I got captured by the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia under gunfire. Do you want my story? And I said, yes, I want your story. Yes, please. And so she sent it in, and I wrote my friend in Oregon. I said, Steve, I've got your story, and we've got my story, and we've got one heck of a third story, so we're on our way. And 34 vets later, we had put together a book called Red Rivers in a Yellow Field. The title is based on the fact that the South Vietnamese flag is a yellow field with 3 red stripes, which represent the 3 major rivers of Vietnam. So the red rivers in a yellow field link to the South Vietnam flag, and anybody who's served in Vietnam has a Vietnam Service Medal or ribbon, which is a yellow ribbon with the red stripes in it that relates to the flag, which is now thought of because it's now a communist country again, and that flag is not the national flag, but it's a very much strong heritage flag for South Vietnamese who cherish that. So that was a really interesting project as a historian, not as an architectural historian, to get involved in that side of military history. And then a colleague in Maryland heard that I had just done this Vietnam book, and they said, you ought to write a history of the Ocean City Beach Patrol, which is an organization of lifeguards that are surf rescue lifeguards. And there's this extraordinary activity over a period of years from the 1930s on. You know more about it than anybody. And of course, the inside joke was that my father was a man who joined that lifeguard organization in 1935, became captain of the lifeguards in 1946, and ran the show till 1987. So from the period of time we were talking about, he had been involved over half the history of the organization. I then, when I was in college, joined the Beach Patrol, and in the summers when I was not in college in Illinois, I was in Maryland as a lifeguard. My son became historically the first third-generation lifeguard in that organization. So they cornered me. I couldn't say no. I mean, they said, you know more about it than anybody. So we were sitting on the beach one day, and my son's fiance takes a photograph of this lifeguard on a lifeguard stand with a furling flag, and it said, that's really good, I'm going to put that on the cover. So that became the cover of the Arcadia, which is the first of the Arcadia books that I've written. There are 3 of them over there. The 2 that we're celebrating tonight are the second and the third, the Georgia Tech Architecture Building and the Campus Guide and the book on public art. But the first one was Maryland's Ocean City Beach Patrol. And I found very quickly, and this happened twice in this series of books, is that the template that Arcadia subscribes for the Images of America series is fairly restricted. All those books, and you recognize them, they all have sepia covers, they're all the same length, they all have roughly the same number of photographs, they're usually 2 per page. There's just so many words on every caption. Every bit of that is prescribed. You cannot write more than 70 words on a caption. You cannot write more than such and such on a chapter. And I just knew too much to be restricted to that. I said, I can't live with this. So I said, well, I will write the Maryland's Ocean City Beach Patrol the way you want it. We'll fill it with photographs. It's got all kinds of historic photographs. If, ladies and gentlemen would be interested in it, it's full of pictures of hunks in there, because you know what your view of the lifeguard is. You think these guys are just sitting in the sun all day and glorying and basking in their youth. However, it really is telling all that they're involved and how many lives these people saved, pulling people out of riptides and getting letters back. Well, there was all that I couldn't include in that. So I said, I'm going to write a second book that is the book I want to write on the same subject. So I went back to the publisher who published the Vietnam book, and I said, this is not exactly down your line of military history, but the organization is slightly military in its organizing. They have a captain and there are 2 lieutenants and sergeants, etc. So, I mean, it's got that structure, but it's not really a military organization. And I said, that's all right, we'll do it. So the second book, called Saving Lives, has far more narrative, and it allows me to share the most extraordinary stories that these young men have been involved, and women now. My dad was the first to hire a female lifeguard. There are 40-some of them now. When I was a guard, there were 45 on the whole squad. There are now 245 because they cover the entire Maryland coast of the Atlantic Ocean that's not part of Assateague National Park. But it's 10 miles of beach now that was much bigger than it was when I was there. So that got finished, and as soon as that was over, a local website said to me, we'd like you to write more about the Ocean City Beach Patrol. In fact, while you're at it, why don't you write something about growing up in this summer resort in the 1950s and 60s, which is when you were there. And I said, okay. I started writing these essays that they were going to put online, and one thing led to another. To make a long story shorter, I found that it was not working out very well on the website, and I said, let me go back to my good publisher at the Vietnam book and see if he would do a semi-autobiographical set of short stories about growing up in the 1950s and 60s. And so Oyster Shell Alleys is all about that. If those of you who know me, we're going to find all sorts of stuff about me you don't know that's in that, because there's stories about that activity. And it's about teenage angst and falling in love with listening to Johnny Mathis and Paul Anka. It's got all that stuff in there from that era. And it was great fun to write these stories, but one of the things that I wanted really to use, and I couldn't quite get it the way I wanted it, was to, there's a great photograph of Johnny Mathis that I want to put on there. It was a painting that was on the cover of his Heavenly album. I don't know if any of you know that, but it's a circular view, and he's standing there in his typical concert garb of white pants, white sweater, and it looks like white clouds. He looks downright angelic, and the album is called Heavenly, and it's this absolutely great picture of Johnny Mathis. And I said, I want to put that as one of the illustrations. This book is going to be full of illustrations of all kinds of stuff. Publisher says, no, 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 you better not touch album covers. And I said, why? He said, they will tear you apart with royalties. You'll never be able to do it. Half the time they won't give you permission. And I said, yeah, but I really want to have this picture in here. I mean, this is a great, great photo of Johnny Mathis. And we had a special connection with Johnny Mathis because Carol and I got tickets to see Johnny Mathis at the Fox Theater, and we thought there's no way we're not going to get to go to this concert. But she was pregnant with our son. This was way back in the 70s, and he was not due for 6 weeks. So we thought this is plenty safe, except he decided to come 6 weeks to the day early, and we missed the concert with Johnny Mathis because of being at Northside Hospital with Carol giving birth to Christopher. Well, years later, we went back and told Johnny Mathis that story because we saw him when he came back just a few years ago. He is still giving concerts, by the way, and is well in his 80s now. You'd never know he wasn't still a teenager. One of the things you may not know about him is that he was such a great athlete that when he was finishing up his time in college, he had a choice to make for career. He was either going to go to the Melbourne Olympics in track and field, or he was going to go to New York and cut a test record, and he decided to go to New York. And of course, he's been singing for how many years since. So Oyster Shell Alleys does have that picture in there, and the reason is that I found the man who painted it, and I got permission to use the painting, not the album cover. And in fact, the man who painted it had passed away, but the guy who ran his estate gave me the permission, and so it went all kinds of convoluted ways, but we got it going. Irma's Seed is a book of poetry also about the same era, and of course, that led to these last two, which are the major kind of studies of the last year or two. All of these have taken place since I retired, this last group of 9 books. And of course, COVID is to blame for that. I couldn't go anywhere, so I just sat in my office and wrote books. I mean, this is the way to kind of get these stuff up. You just kind of get, less distraction when you're retired, but even less if you're quarantined. So that's where a lot of this production came. I think there are 4 or 5 of them. They're all copyrighted 2021, so they're all that recent. And it's been great that these publishers have been able to grab hold of them. The Georgia Tech architecture book covers every building on campus. It has some brief illustration and caption describing them. It too will have a follow-up book like Saving Lives, because I was really constricted with what I could say about Georgia Tech, and so I have in production a second Georgia Tech architecture guide, which is going to be called Campus Walks, and the same publisher that did the Vietnam book is going to publish that. And then at the same time we were doing this, I decided that I would take some material I had on sculpture and was discovering all these extraordinary murals that were being built around the school and around the city, and publish the book on public art in Atlanta. It deals with historic public art, which is a lot of outdoor sculpture around the Capitol and various other places. I spent probably an hour trying to find the Jefferson statue that's supposed to be around this building, and found that they had taken it away because Jefferson owned slaves. So that problem is that same problem that hit Richmond is hit DeKalb. But there's also a chapter on Julian Harris, who was a tech man and had a lot of stuff on tech campus, some on John Portman's sculpture, a good group of stuff on civil rights art, other art that shows African influence, immigration and international art. There are more than 1,000 murals in Atlanta. It's unbelievable how many there are, and some of them are artists from Barcelona, from Paris, from Brussels, from all over the world, and in fact, one of the people that went to high school at Grady with my son, who became a graffiti artist and then started doing these wonderful murals around town, I wrote and told him about tonight's event, and he said, I can't come, I'm in Belgium on a project. This guy does stuff all over the world now. He's done murals in Peru and in Australia, and he's currently in Belgium doing another one, but he's got 5 or 6 of them right here in Atlanta. guy named Alex Brewer, who goes by Hence. And sports art and pop culture and all kinds of stuff that's all in there. So it's an effort to give a kind of broad overview. And as I say, that will get followed. We don't know quite what the cover is going to look like. We're still working that out on the campus walks, a second history of Georgia Tech architecture, which we project for 2022. So that's the group of books that are around, and I think that if you came particularly about the Georgia Tech architecture book or the public art book, we have copies of those, but we have some of the others. The Mabeck book and the Pringle and Smith book are discounted. The others, are just fairly almost brand new out, and so they're at the normal price you pay anywhere for them. And so we appreciate it if any of you are interested, and I can autograph them or I can dedicate them to Mother or whatever you want me to do on the inside, and get something personal that gets to be put on them if you are interested in that. Any questions or any kinds of comments or observations or things you want to share about your own work? Yeah.
It's a little off the topic, like from an architecture standpoint, but the area of Georgia Tech's campus where the Greek houses are now.
Where what is?
The Greek houses, the sororities and fraternities.
Can you pull your mask down because I can't hear it? Yeah.
The area of the Tech campus where the sororities and fraternities are, I think used to be just like a regular neighborhood.
Yes.
Was incorporated into Tech. Do you know anything about that, or where I can find out more about that?
Well, there are 3 or 4 houses that are still standing there that are still part of that original neighborhood. The 2 or 3 churches that are on 10th Street, one of which was Lester Maddox Church. They tore one of them down just a couple years ago. It was right on the corner of Hemp Hill, but they have another one that's still there. And that whole neighborhood, which is now called Home Park, between 10th and Atlantic Station, was built as resident housing for the workers of the steel mill that was in the Atlantic Station plot of ground. Has now been developed, and some of those houses that went really all the way to the back side of Georgia Tech, when Georgia Tech was just founded, where Tech Tower is on North Avenue, and it didn't go much past 3rd Street. So 3rd and 4th and 5th all the way to 10th, it was much like what 10th to 14th still is, which is small houses as a community of residents originally built to house the workers in Atlantic Steel. That's what all of that pretty well was. Slowly Tech kept moving, but even when I came in '73, it was sort of an unwritten thing that they really weren't going to go past 10th Street. So it was somewhat contained by 10th. A lot of the Tech students rent houses between 10th and 14th Street, and that's where they're finding overflow housing. The Olympics doubled the amount of houses, the amount of beds that they had on campus, but they still were only able to cover about 2/3 of the student population at the best, and then they've had even more student increase in population since then, but the dormitories haven't increased, so it's still got a lot of pressure on those houses. The ones that are still right there on 4th Street or 5th Street that are used and are as they have always been, one of them is the Lutheran Center, one of the religious organizations. 1 or 2 would be a house that would be used by a starter-up sorority or fraternity before it really developed itself. And then if they got large enough and affiliated with a national group, then they might build their own fraternity house. But a lot of them have had several different fraternities that have used one of those smaller houses. And Paul Heffern's house is still there, which is one of the directors of the architecture program from the 50s. His house was remodeled in the 60s, but it's essentially one of those that you're describing. Yes.
I was going to ask, if you were thinking about a particular Atlanta neighborhood that was maybe like a hidden gem that you could take people on a tour, what would that area of Atlanta be? Or that spot that you think is just not well known, but still something that's really worth looking at and preserving?
Well, there really are a lot. I think a lot has to depend on what your interest is. I've discovered more even in doing this public art project, because when you're looking for a mural that could be anywhere, southwest, southeast, northwest, northeast, wherever it is, you go through neighbors that you never necessarily have been in before, and there's some really beautiful parks and interesting areas. Cascade Heights, for instance, recently was put on the National Register as an African-American neighborhood, sort of on the west, southwest side. So many of them changed so quickly too. I mean, when in the 70s, a lot of the renovation that's going on in West End, it seems almost passé now, but it's a whole different character. I have this eclectic interest in multiple kinds of topics, and so sometimes I'll be going into an area because I'm interested in mid-century modern houses, for instance, and so there are 2 or 3 neighborhoods in the Northwest in which street after street are all developed in a period of maybe 5 or 6 years in the 1960s by the same builder or the same architect, and that becomes interesting because it's this enclave of that period of work. There used to be a couple of streets, what was it called, Golf? I can't remember now what it is, but it was just off Collier Road that had works by Bill Finch and early George Heary and some of the early modernist Fab Rap architects in this little cul-de-sac, and that has those houses have been changed in the last 20 years. A lot of them have had second floors put on them, and some have been torn down and other houses put in. Some of the original ones are still there, but it's not nearly as intact as it was originally. It was this wonderful little cul-de-sac of early modern architecture. But again, there's sections of Candler Park that I like because of the bungalows and the continuity of that sort of stickly aesthetic, which is quite admirable. And of course, nothing's comparable to Inman Park with the Victorian. My house is Victorian. It's more on the scale of what's in Inman Park, but there's so many really nice, restored, well-restored houses in Inman Park. It's a whole different character. I usually, if somebody comes into town, I'm going to drive them around. I try to sort of hit all of them if I can, give them a whole afternoon grand tour.
You were supposed to say Grant Park, because that's where I live.
Excuse me?
So you were supposed to say Grant Park, because I live in Grant Park.
You live in Grant Park. We restored a house in Grant Park and had students there living there for a while. We didn't hold on to it very long, but we had it for a while. This was part of the stepping stone to doing the benefit. It was on Glenwood.
Glenwood, yeah. That's great. Awesome.
Lots of experience. No, we had some friends that were in Grant Park, and it's a nice neighborhood. It really is. Yes.
What are your thoughts on the loss of the high tower building?
The loss.
That how they tore down the high tower building?
Yes. She's talking about the textile engineering building on Georgia Tech's campus. Well, I'll tell you that when there were efforts to get public comment from the community, i.e. from Georgia Tech, I was the only one there that spoke publicly against tearing it down. So, it was a real loss. This is a building that was part of what Paul Heffernan, he was a Paris Prize winning architect. That means that he won the national prize. It's given to one architecture student a year, and in the 1930s he won it, and the winner goes to Paris for 2 years, studies at the École des Beaux-Arts, but doesn't have to take all the entrance exam. He goes straight into the second level class. I mean basically the first level class. And he spends 2 years studying in Paris, and then he's hired by Georgia Tech immediately and comes back and begins to build campus buildings, starting with Hinman, but the high tower was the second one. And his intention was to build a series of early modern aesthetic buildings, what we call the modern academic village, using the Jefferson kind of reference, of which the textile engineering building, the architecture building from the 50s, the Price Gilbert Library, and what he then was intending to build as a administration bridge and a large classroom building that would be affixed to the Price Gilbert, and all that complex was going to be a new, modern focal point for Georgia Tech. They thought at the time that the bridge that was going to go across the connector was going to be on 4th Street instead of 5th Street. And so it's 4th Street is where the architecture building is, and Hemp Hill carried on right through campus to North Avenue at that time, and the textile building was on 4th and Hemp Hill. So that was going to be a whole new entrance, and it was going to be a modern entrance for Georgia Tech, and the textile engineering was going to be the kind of key building as you came in from that west side, and all of that disappeared over time, and by the time they got to the designs of what was going to be the new campus green, what they did with the Clough undergraduate building, they tore that down because the footprint was in the wrong place. And but it really is one of his masterpieces, and it's a shame because he is the leading early modernist in the city and taught so many people. I mean, the people in his classes included Tom Michelet, George Herian, I mean, the big names of the post-World War II era. My best experience with Paul Heffernan was that just before he retired, he hired me. And 2 or 3 years later, when the Paris program came up, which he had just started, one of the last things he did before he resigned as director and retired was to start the Paris program, which ran for 30-some years, sending students like he did to Paris to study. And so when I was asked to go and head up the Paris program, I was a historian, and I knew I needed a design teacher, a really good studio teacher. And I said to myself, who's the best design teacher in this whole city? And it was Paul Heffernan. Well, he was retired. I said, Paul, you hired me, can I hire you back? And he said, you're darn right you can hire me back if you're going to send me to Paris. So I went to Paris for 7 months with Paul Heffernan. And so it was really a wonderful, wonderful time. And
well, thank you so much
yes,
for coming
indeed.
today. And we have all of his books that you can purchase, and you can do card.
Thank you.